This morning, we're going to dive into a particular framework of Christian theology. I'm going to ask you to go on a little bit of a journey with me, not to convert you to liberation theology, but to help us understand our neighbors and our mutual work for creating justice in the world. I want to start that journey with our reading from just a moment ago. You may remember it ended with the familiar words, "Let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." We know those words from Dr. King and probably other places as well. While we know that line, you probably weren't as familiar with the rest of the reading. In fact, it's a little odd. I despise your festivals. The offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon them. This reading that we thought was familiar comes from the book of Amos in the Hebrew Bible. Amos was a prophet for the Jewish people living around 750 BC, a very long time ago. And I won't go into too many details, but at that point, the Israelites had found some political stability, which was a rare thing in those days. And with that stability came some financial success. But the traditional system of land ownership broke down, and an ultra-wealthy class emerged at the top of society. So the book of Amos is a collection of words from the prophet and the stories about him, and his speeches are prophetic announcements. He's speaking on behalf of God. That's what's happening in that passage that we heard from earlier. The part that we're so familiar with, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream," comes at the end of a terribly damning indictment of the people of Israel and a prediction of God's wrath that will befall them. In this passage, God is angry and vengeful at the status quo of his own chosen people. He threatens great punishment for their greed and oppressive ways. So I chose this reading this morning for two reasons. One is that the wider book of Amos is a good entry point for understanding liberation theology. Roughly speaking, liberation theology suggests that God is primarily concerned with the well-being of the oppressed and the poor. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the second reason I chose this reading is our comfortable misinterpretation of it. It shows how most white American liberals understand liberation theology. We focus on the justice for all part. We rather comfortably forget the idea that God prefers the poor and the oppressed. We comfortably forget that when one group is oppressed, another group is the oppressor. We forget that we might be a part of that dominant group. For the most part, when we hear liberation theology, we think of religious ideas that promote justice, and they do that. But there's a whole lot more to it. That's why I want to talk about it today. What is liberation theology, and how do we relate to it as Unitarian Universalists? Oh, and by the way, if you were wondering, those predictions from the prophet Amos came true. About 10 years later, Israel was wiped out by an Assyrian king and taken into exile. So, liberation theology comes in a few different varieties. It's best known from Latin America and Catholicism of the 1950s. A priest named Gustavo Gutierrez wrote the book A Theology of Liberation and sort of gave the movement its name. But in that same period, a parallel movement was arising here in the United States called Black theology. While liberation theology in Latin America focused on liberation for the people there, Black theology sought liberation for non-white people here in the United States. Now, following those two movements, feminist theology came along, queer theology, disabled theology, all emerged with this similar idea of understanding God through their own lens and seeing God as allied with the marginalized. So I mentioned a couple of times that there's this core idea that God is on the side of the oppressed. You may have heard the term a preferential option for the poor. That was the way Gustavo Gutierrez framed it. He was very careful to use that word preference because he didn't want to leave anyone out of God's love. It wasn't an exclusion, it was just a preference. Others took a firmer stand about God's preference for the poor, and that would be James Cone from Black Theology. He took a lot of his framework from the story that we heard earlier about the Israelites escaping from Egypt. In fact, he explicitly compared the United States to Egypt, predicting that oppressed people would soon be led to a promised land. And he said that the same God is working for oppressed black people today. Remember, that story was not gentle on the Egyptians. In fact, I whittled it down to be about as gentle as I could and still keep any integrity to it. Whether it's a gentler preference for the poor or a more punitive alignment, liberation theology suggests that God is on the side of the oppressed. And there are plenty of passages in the Bible to back that up. The other key piece of liberation theology that I want to bring up is a commitment to action. Gustavo Gutierrez talked about orthopraxy instead of orthodoxy. He's more interested in right action than in right belief. And it's not just a hierarchical question, it's also a question of which comes first. Liberation theology suggests that we first engage with the work and the justice and the people, and then consider the framework of theology after that. Several of us here at Tapestry read a book by Brian Stevenson, and we later heard him speak at General Assembly. Stevenson spoke about orthopraxy in terms of proximity. He was, as a young law student, found himself doing an internship with inmates on death row. He had kind of lost his interest in the law and was floundering in school until he had his first encounter with someone on death row and realized that his work could change lives and that the legal system was there for something. He told us that in order to be a part of the solution to the world's problems, we must start by getting closer to the people who are most impacted. Only then, when we've known the impacts on a personal level, can we draw any conclusion about the broader framework of what's going on. It's a cycle of action and then reflection. It's really a revolutionary model, not just for society at large, but for the church too. For decades, Catholic leaders, all the way up to the Pope, have tried to navigate how to deal with liberation theology. A church that owns billions of dollars worth of artwork alone is troubled by a depiction of a God that stands with the poor in opposition to the wealthy. And its an emphasis on lay interpretation of the Bible sort of chafes the traditional clergy-led Catholic structure. It's a complicated relationship. And black theology exists within the African American tradition in much the same way. Their conflict isn't quite as visible, but this struggle is there as affluent black churches and those with more conservative theologies bristle at the outspoken nature of black theology. At this point, I've told you way more about liberation theology than you probably wanted to know, but I'm telling you these core concepts for a reason. Most of us have heard the phrase liberation theology, and most of us have misunderstood it. Just like we embraced "let justice roll down like waters" from Amos, we haven't understood the background information. Beyond supporting social justice, liberation theology has some very particular theological beliefs. And there are some pieces of it that we work well with as Unitarian Universalists, and other pieces that are very different. Not all of us believe in God that is active in the world. Some of us don't believe in God no matter how you slice it. And for those Unitarians that do believe in God, it's a more nuanced idea. It's a God that's present in our loving human relationships, or a general good and creative force that's available in the world throughout time. For us, the idea of God picking sides, bringing justice, and perhaps punishing the oppressor is not easy to swallow. The favoritism and punishment gets even more complicated when we understand that most of us in this room are likely to be on the punishment end of the preferred, more on the punishment end than the preferred end of that equation. The other point of discomfort for us is the focus on action before analysis. We are a heady people. We tend to want to know what's going on. What's the history? What's the public policy? What's the strategy before we take a step into relationships? Doing our homework is okay, but liberation theology tells us that heart learning that occurs on the scene is more important than head learning that happens in the classroom. And that makes us, with our multiple degrees and our commitment to analytical thinking, a little uncomfortable. As much as we claim a connection to justice work, we need to reconcile some of those differences. We were involved in the civil rights movement, and we're proud of that history. Here in Southern California, we joined farm workers in boycotts, and today we work with mostly Catholic, mostly Latino neighbors in their struggle for immigration justice. To be real allies, it's helpful to know what sustains our neighbors in the struggle for justice. The other reason to reconcile our differences with liberation theology is that the tradition has a lot to offer spiritually. The music alone, the music of the civil rights movement, the long history of spirituals, is a uniquely American form of music that stirs our souls, but we need to understand it if we're going to be singing it. And the invitation to step forward before we have a complete and thorough analysis of the problem, that could be so liberating for our faith. For those of us who believe in God, we might come to know God in new and deeper ways through liberation theology. There are a few different ways of reconciling differences. One, I realized just on Monday night, a handful of us were in a book discussion talking about the book Understanding the Bible, an Introduction for Skeptics, Seekers, and Religious Liberals. Instead of talking about the book, which honestly was a little bit dry, we mostly talked about our personal relationships with the Bible. And one person in the conversation found almost nothing redeeming about the Bible. He simply didn't believe any of it, the history or the theology. That's not a unique perspective. In a rare moment of clarity, though, I asked about separating belief from appreciation. You don't have to believe a single word of the Bible to appreciate that it's had a huge influence on Western culture. You can even appreciate some of the moral lessons without believing the historical accuracy or the theological agenda. The same is true for liberation theology. The beliefs that provide spiritual sustenance to marginalized people, the beliefs that empower them to fight back against some of the greatest human powers in history, those ideas are worth appreciating, even when we don't believe them ourselves. And appreciation often leads to curiosity. We might wonder, what does it mean if God or truth or goodness or your highest ideals or whatever you want to call it, what if that is on the side of the oppressed? If God is aligned with the marginalized, then how are we called to manage our own power and resources in the world? Are we supposed to give it all away? Are we called to use our power to give voice to those that have been silenced? Maybe we're called to get closer to the marginalized and find out what they have to teach us about goodness and God. Appreciation leads to curiosity. These aren't answers that I offer, but questions that arise if we pause to appreciate the faith of our neighbors who struggle for justice. Liberation theology is a powerful lens to better understand God and our world. It's a foundation for generations of justice making in the Americas. We can certainly appreciate it and not believe it, but appreciating it is a great gateway to curiosity where real growth happens. Amen.